Welcome to The Business. I'm Lanran Kinola. On this show, we break down business and its impact on Africa and Africans. Business affects every one of us, whoever we are, wherever we are. Over the next half hour, we discuss, examine, and analyze business in Africa and beyond. This week on The Business, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced his government aims to secure $100 billion of investment, ambitious for a country that secured just $3.4 billion last year. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari announces he will meet US President Donald Trump on April 30th. What will they discuss? Sub-Saharan Africa is on course to grow by 3.1% in 2018, according to the World Bank, up from 2.6% last year. What's driving the recovery? In this week's big story, as the Commonwealth Summit draws to a close in London, we look at what the organization offers to Africa. And in this week's breakdown, does Africa have a hidden debt problem? Joining me throughout for commentary and analysis is business reporter Thomas Collins. And in part two, I'll be talking to Ada Osakwe, founder and CEO of AgriLay Ventures. For our first story this week, we go to South Africa, where Cyril Ramaphosa has announced plans to attract $100 billion of investment into the country. He's announced a hand-picked team of former financiers and former ministers to go out as envoys and attract and secure investment globally from Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. The only important question of how exactly this is going to happen remains unanswered. Tom, $100 billion is a lot of money. How is Cyril Ramaphosa going to get this money?
Well, that is the big question. Where is this money going to come from? Last year they got $3.4 billion, and that was a 43% increase from the year before. Although that said, that was under President Jacob Zuma, so I think now in his new presidency, Cyril Ramaphosa is a lot more open to the market. He's attracting investors, and he's done a number of things to give some confidence.
So part of this is PR. Part of this is he understands he has to appease investors. He has to restore confidence, which was damaged under Jacob Zuma. But he also has to deliver. South Africans have mobile phones. They have TV. They know he's making these promises, even though he's making them in London.
Yeah, it's a strange response. If you put the bar slightly lower at 50 billion, then maybe you might be able to achieve it. But I think on the whole, he'll work towards it, but never finally reach that target.
All right. $100 billion, easier said than done. President Muhammadu Buhari is set to meet Donald Trump at the White House on April 30th. It's the first official visit by an African head of state to the White House and comes after a series of controversies around comments by Donald Trump on Africa. And it's safe to say that a year into the Trump presidency, US-Africa relations are not off to a great start. Tom, finally sitting down with one of Africa's most important leaders, could this mark a bit of a turning point in what so far have been pretty frosty relationship?
Yeah, I think this is more of a PR exercise, a diplomatic visit to Washington to see Donald Trump. Obviously very important for Buhari as one of the largest economies in the world. But I think what they're going to discuss still remains unknown.
So Trump has come out. He said some nasty things about Africa, but it's not just about Donald Trump. It's not just about having good relations with the man in the White House. Surely there's a bigger picture here as well, and it's not. It doesn't sort of sink or swim on this.
And last February, just into Trump's presidency, they had a phone call from Washington to Lagos, and Buhari picked it up, and they were talking about security. And I think that is the main thing they'll be discussing. Boko Haram in the northeast of Nigeria is the main topic of conversation.
That's a very important point there. What exactly are they going to be talking about? Security will undoubtedly dominate. Will there be much room for investment in the economy here? Is there any indication of what Donald Trump thinks on Africa and investing in Africa?
Well, US policy so far to Africa has been very unclear. He sent the ex-Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, to Ethiopia a couple of months ago. Rex Tillerson got back to Washington and then was fired. So this kind of leaves the African government saying, you know, where do we stand and what are your intentions on the continent?
Thank you, Tom. Hopefully this meeting can go some way to providing a bit of clarity. The World Bank expects sub-Saharan Africa to grow by 3.1% this year. While slightly lower than an original projection of 3.2%, this is still above the 2.6% we saw last year and is part of a nascent recovery across the continent. Tom, it's good news for growth. We've had 2 years of very poor growth. We had like 1.5%, 1.6% in 2016, 2.6% last year. We're still way off the 5% average that we've had for much of the last decade. But relatively good news. What's driving this?
And this is, of course, all commodities picking back up and driving growth in the markets. The real scare, though, is that if the market crashes again, what will happen to these economies is that so far there's been very little diversification efforts.
So the headline figure is good. It's not enough. It's not fast enough. And this link to commodities is a bit problematic because it's South Africa, it's Nigeria, it's Angola that are kind of driving this this upturn in growth figures. You touched on the need for diversification. Is enough being done to address this?
I don't think so, no. Agriculture, tech are all bigger and larger ways to get money back into your Federal Reserves. But they've not done that so far, and it's really just bouncing on the back of this oil. So I think, you know, if China starts to raise the interest rates and there's a growing war between China and the US and they start to fall in their economy, this might impact badly on commodities in Africa, and we'll see another recession.
Thank you, Tom. Growth is a good thing, but it needs to be harnessed. For this week's big story, we look at the Commonwealth. Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit has just concluded in London, and Theresa May's government is trying to promote the Commonwealth as an alternative to its trade relationship with the European Union once Brexit actually takes place. A big part of that, at least as far as the rhetoric goes, is trading more with Africa. But it isn't entirely clear how that's going to happen and how relevant the institution is to the Africa of the 21st century. Tom, it sounds good, but how exactly can Africa benefit from something like the Commonwealth? Does it really apply to where Africa is today?
I think that is the big question. You know, regional groupings are getting stronger in Africa, in Asia, around the world. This is kind of criticized as a neo-colonial kind of instrument. Really,
it's mostly former colonies.
It's mostly former colonies, yeah, with the exception of Cameroon, a French-speaking, Mozambique joined. They were the last two to join. But, you know, I think this is more important for Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, than the African countries.
And in actual practical terms, where does Africa sit in the Commonwealth? 80% of its GDP, which was around $10 trillion, is in just 4 countries. And those 4 countries, none of them are African. It's Britain, India, Australia, and Canada. Africa doesn't even register in this case. So what realistically is the opportunity here? So
they're a smaller player in this large 53-member grouping, but I think judging by Theresa May's comments in the Department of International Trade, they want to look towards Africa. So she will try and establish this as her kind of buffer to leaving the EU.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. Looks like the Commonwealth has some catching up to do in the 21st century. In our breakdown this week, we ask whether Africa has a hidden debt problem. It's been reported this week that there are concerns that Zambia might have understated the level of its borrowing in recent years, which is spooking investors and complicating a situation in which the country is desperately trying to get an IMF bailout, but is already facing concerns around how it's managing the economy. The bigger picture here is that across Africa, concerns about rising debt levels are increasing. This year, the estimate is that the average level of debt is going to be 53%. And servicing is at its highest since it was in 2001 at around 12%. In Ghana, 35% of government revenue already goes to servicing debt. Tom, we've got a debt crisis brewing. Now we have another dimension here, which is the market doesn't trust African governments to even tell them how much they owe.
Yeah, undisclosed loans are becoming a growing problem in Africa. Like you said, Mozambique, Zambia, even the Congo. And if investors can't really see where they're putting their money, they're going to be hesitant to put it in and they won't know whether they'll get it back.
And we've seen the cost of this. Mozambique had a very similar experience just last year. They uncovered more than $1 billion in undisclosed loans, and that has made an already really intense financial crisis that much worse. It's going to take years for Mozambique to recover. So if you're Zambia right now, the last thing you want to do is admit to undisclosed loans.
And that's it, Mozambique, $2 billion. It's a huge sum of money, and that's really going to spook all the investors. But what needs to happen, international organizations, maybe the AU, needs to set up an instrument that will better monitor loans and undisclosed debt in these African countries.
And the need for transparency is very important here. It's not easy to disclose this, and we've seen what happens if you fall foul of the rules in a place like Mozambique. But we've had instances like Uganda's central bank warning its own government that we might default on our debt because we're borrowing too much. So clearly, there's a need for African governments to become a little bit more honest here.
Yeah, and in Uganda, public debt has risen 3 times. They need to be honest, but they also need to find better ways of financing their large infrastructure projects, like, for instance, tax, fiscal policy, all these things. To go to a debtor, to a loanee and get money, I mean, it's not a sustainable solution for the future.
Tom, thank you as always for all the commentary and insight. Hope to see you on the show again very soon.
Thank you.
Debt is important, but it has to be well managed. We'll take a quick break now. Join me in part 2 when I'll be talking to Ada Osakwe, founder and CEO of AgriLay Ventures. Welcome back to The Business, the show where we break down business and its effect on Africa and Africans. I'm Lanre Akinola, and I'm pleased to be joined by Ada Osakwe, founder and CEO of AgriLay Ventures. Ada, thank you very much for joining me on the show
Thanks for having
today.
me, Lanre.
Now, when it comes to Africa, there are certain themes when we talk of development, investment, and growth that are recurring. Youth is one of them, entrepreneurship is one of them, agriculture is one of them, and women empowerment is one of them. Governments tell us these are 4 key priorities. You fall into every one of these categories. You are a woman, a youth entrepreneur, and your focus is agribusiness in Nigeria,
Yes.
okay? So what I really want to get out of this is a bit of a first-hand sense of what it takes to be an entrepreneur in Africa. Never mind the rhetoric, never mind what the government says. What is the reality on the ground? So let's start first of all with why have you picked something like agriculture, a notoriously difficult sector?
Yeah.
What is it about agriculture? Why do you feel like this is where you want to be, this is where you want to start a company?
Now, Larry, it's a great question and one that I get asked frequently. Because when you think about my background, finance, private equity, I had worked in development finance. But for me, I was still kind of looking for an area that I could not only keep being relevant in private investing and ensuring that private sector was driving growth, but an area that could be life-changing for millions of people in my country and the continent in general. And when you think about agriculture and a space that Africa in general is spending over $40 billion annually importing food that we can actually produce locally, it's kind of mind-boggling. And the fact that we still have such high levels of unemployment or poverty levels amongst our farmers. So imagine if we can kind of flip the game and start making sure that we are producing the things that we consume locally. And for me, that's really why I got really passionate about the space and trying to transform it in a way that made sense. Let's stop focusing on only, yes, productivity is important and the farm and primary agriculture is important, the hoe and cutlass that people think, but let's move on to the value-added processing of things and ensuring that Africa is tapping into the global food industry that's worth trillions of dollars.
Okay, now, how does that work in practice? Now, and just for context, you have spent time in government. You did spend some time at the Ministry of Agriculture. How important was that in shaping your view?
Larry, it was transformational. For me, I had done stuff from, like I said, private equity, infrastructure, finance, capital markets development on the continent, but finally going into government and actually seeing the power of policies in being able to truly open up entrepreneurship, to open up the doors for everyday person, you and I, to basically say, I want to start a business. And I was lucky at the time, I was with a minister in cabinet of agriculture who was a visionary and who
This is Adesina when he was
Dr. Adesina, exactly. And at the time, he was the one who proposed issues like, let's have an agricultural transformation. Let's make it government enabled, but private sector driven. We don't have to do anything. Government doesn't even have to put money, but just make sure the laws are there, the laws that protect
and the market will
sort of step in and let it work. And that's really what we try to do. And I saw the power of that. And for me, that's really why I feel that although I've left now, I do think at some point, you know, that really is what makes a difference.
So now you you talk the talk in government, you then decided to put your money where your mouth is and actually become an agribusiness entrepreneur.
Sure.
Do you, looking back now on your expectations when you went into this and where you are now, what's really surprised you? What's caught you off guard? Has it been as easy as you thought it would be?
No, I never thought it was easy, but I didn't think it was going to be this difficult. It's been a journey, Lanway, and it's been a journey of 3 years now and counting, being an entrepreneur and specifically an agribusiness entrepreneur in an area that people didn't think was like sexy
Exactly,
or cool.
far from it. Right?
And now we're more or less going around and saying we're talking about farm to table. We're talking about building products that come from the farm, but making them to world-class food standards. It's not been easy. Infrastructure challenges, challenges around the government being so archaic in the way they think with regards to how they support enterprise. I think that's a big hassle. Every day I'm doing anything from going for meetings with investors or potential suppliers to getting calls from my staff telling me, oh, somebody's here and they say we have to pay this bill or this levy that I've already paid.
They bulldozed one of your stores,
yes,
right?
In September in 2016, I woke up one day to a call where they said our store was being demolished, and that was a 5-week-old store that was employing about 20, globally in the firm at the time, 20 youths, young people. And for me, at the time that happened, it was, to your point about the difference in government and how detached they are, this was at the time that the week before Mark Zuckerberg had just come to Nigeria for the first time, and they were touting issues around young enterprise and youth.
How they're empowering young people.
Precisely, and that same week we had just announced the recession. Nigeria was going through a recession, and there I am, putting my money into a business, employing young people, putting money and paying taxes.
And being punished for it. Or at least it would have felt like you were being punished for it.
So yeah, that's difficult to kind of chew.
Now, I want to pick up on that point, and I want to get a better sense of what some of the obstacles have been. But before we do that, tell us a little bit about what exactly AgroLay Ventures does. You spoke of local sourcing, local produce, which is the deep end of the spectrum here. I mean, agriculture is a difficult sector. Local production, we know how complicated it is, how difficult that is. How do you make that work? And you very kindly brought some some samples with you, and you're telling me this is 100% Nigerian.
100%.
Packaging, everything that's inside and on the outside.
Everything is Nigerian. That drink, for example, we use hibiscus flower, and people tell us around the world how companies like Starbucks, they source and they love Nigeria's hibiscus, yet locally we don't even have a drink that has hibiscus, and that's what we're trying to do. Let's put the money in the hands of our hibiscus farmers, right? And so AgroLay Ventures really looks out for that. We look out for companies that more or less look across the value chain, specifically at the food value processed aspect of agriculture. Innovative companies that are doing things with our local produce to tap into the $3 trillion packaged foods industry. But when you go to Tesco's or Waitrose, you don't see made in Africa products sitting there. So that's what we want to transform. And a second thing is that my past life was in private equity, and I got disillusioned with the people going around wanting to put big $50 million tickets into transactions, and there were not enough of those. I was like, if you're all wearing these suits and going around, who's actually building the businesses? For me, and then who's doing those earlier stage investments? So AgroLay more or less is an early stage investor in young agripreneurs.
This seems to, at least on the surface, fit perfectly into the agenda that the Nigerian government's put out there. There's a Made in Nigeria campaign.
Precisely.
There's a lot of rhetoric around supporting local entrepreneurs, supporting young people, especially in things like agribusiness. When you hear the rhetoric and how does that fit?
There are a lot of tours of pictures and media opportunities with our officials going around and taking shots with, but then it doesn't trickle down. Nigeria's today saying stuff about having moved up the ranks in the World Bank's Doing Business report. And I looked at that and I just couldn't believe it, that I was celebrating that. We need to look at issues around our tax laws. When you look at a big company who's listed on the exchange, a big manufacturing company versus an adder who's trying to build and is only 1 year old, there's no difference. You still got to pay the same 30% tax. But forget that. It's just about the environment. We have such a serious issue when it comes to lack of human capital. And I know currently it's the World Bank Spring meetings. It's come up in DC. They're talking about it. People talk about the youth dividend, all of that. But Lanway, I'm tired of talking.
Yes.
I'm tired of hearing people talking. What are we doing to transform our educational systems? What are we doing to ensure that young people are equipped with the skills that they need to be relevant for the jobs of the future in Africa? And for me, that really is a pain point and one that I feel very passionate about.
Now, you're in an unusual position in that you've been on both sides. You have been in government. You have seen the transformational power of the right policies, but you've also seen the stifling power of the wrong policies.
True.
Now, how does that shape how you address some of these challenges? Because it's difficult, but
Yes.
can you understand, or do you see why some of these complexities, not making excuses for the government,
Yeah.
but perhaps understanding that the nature of policy making is just not that straightforward?
I agree. It's not straightforward, and sometimes the wrong people get to benefit from what might be a good intention of the government. And that, for me, when you politicize even things to do with intervention funds that are supposed to help the women in agriculture. You know, people tell me, Ada, you're a woman. You know, the Bank of Industry has 50 billion naira for women. And I go look at the rules and regulations and what you need to qualify. They're sitting on that money. They're not able to disburse it. It's so prohibitive in terms of what I say. How does a one-year-old business have all the collateral and the homes and houses and land that you ask for? So there needs to be something different. And I'm afraid that sometimes it's because you have people who are making policies who haven't been practitioners. Until we change that mindset and we get people who truly understand business and enterprise and what it takes, we wouldn't move anywhere.
Ada, thank you so much for joining me on The Business today.
It's great being here.
That's all we have time for. Thank you for watching The Business, and please join us again next time.